nostra natura.
Siamo pronti.
Can you hear me if I stand like this with the microphone like this? Can you hear me?
Lo sentite bene se sta in piedi così? Lo sentite da dietro? No? Sì o no?
Come nearer.
Venite vicino, venite avanti. Siete benvenuti, benvenute. Venite avanti.
Yes. Okay, now the ladies who have the text can give it.
Ok, va bene distribuire adesso i testi, i saggi. Grazie.
Okay, I'm going to speak. This is like the Middle Ages. You know, I am the priest speaking in Latin. Okay, I'm going to begin and you can...
Siamo tornati al Medioevo, lui è il prete che parla in latino e voi dovete seguire e capire.
La messa.
The title of the paper is Politics and Soul. We are up against the wall. Prospects for a new therapy for politics. Introduction. I have been unusually lucky in obtaining work as a political consultant with political leaders, parties and activist groups. These experiences have included working in the 1990s on questions of leadership with Tony Blair and the Labour Party at a time when there seemed to be bright futures for him and for the party. It didn't happen. I also worked on both Obama presidential campaigns in 2008 and 2012. Again, the theme that I consulted on was leadership and what the candidate, Obama, might make of his beloved phrase, the father of the nation. I'm going to ask you to translate something now. It's quite funny. The Americans told me that the phrase, the father of the nation, came from Abraham Lincoln.
È un po' una cosa un po' divertente. Gli americani gli hanno detto che questa frase, il padre della nazione, venne da Abraham Lincoln.
But I told them it comes from Cicero.
Però gli ha risposto che è di Cicerone questa frase.
And they said, oh, how interesting, and ignored it completely.
E allora hanno detto, ma che interessante, e dopo l'hanno ignorato completamente.
I've further worked with the Stop the War coalition, in Britain that is, and done consultancy with Friends of the Earth and with the St. James Alliance, a consortium of faith and spiritual groups committed to social and economic justice based at the famous church St. James in Piccadilly, London. In the professional field, I founded an organisation in the UK called Psychotherapists and Counsellors for Social Responsibility, and I was a co-founder, one of two, of the relatively new Psychotherapy and Counselling Union. Translate, please. This is a trade union for therapists.
L'Unione di Psicoterapia e Consulenza.
No, this is an official trade union for therapists.
Questa è un'ufficiale unione di lavoro per sindacato. Sì.
It's incredible. It's a big innovation.
È incredibile, è una grande innovazione.
We have been conversation. Forget to translate.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. These groups were very active in the June 2017 general election in the UK because there was and is a huge onslaught in Britain on the rights and conditions of the mentally ill. I'm ashamed to say that the mainstream therapy professional organizations, including the union ones, are silent on the question, leaving it up to these smaller radical groupings. So it is obvious that I am an enthusiast for the interfacing of what I call therapy thinking and politics. I have worked in this field for more than 40 years, but just at the time when there could be said to be a political turn in the therapies, I am beginning to get a little bit worried and skeptical. Is the political turn just a fashion or fad? Will actual clinical practice receive a political boost, or will it be business as usual? I'm concerned that therapists and people in the psychological world just try to outdo each other in espousal of progressive politics, forgetting that our own professional politics have historically been rather demeaning and still involve massive personalizing and polarizing of the issues. And I expect my listeners here today know something about this. In addition, the record of the psychotherapies, particularly psychoanalysis, with regard to ethnic and sexual minorities has not been good. We have stigmatized and inferiorized both groups of humanity, and much of the contemporary swing to an opposite point of view may be said, in Edward Said's term, to constitute Orientalism. This means that what looks like liberal support and admiration for the oppressed other is really still a kind of colonial superiority involving a whole set of Olympian norms. In this short talk, I'm going to work on three discrete, separate political themes. 1, leadership and responsibility. 2, economic inequality and a little bit on climate change. And 3, the hidden politics of promiscuous, intimate relationships. Please translate. I've kept the sex to the end, because that's when you'll be going to sleep and it will wake you up.
Ha tenuto il sesto per ultimo perché a quel momento voi starete prendendo sonno, allora per svegliarvi un po'.
From time to time, I will ask you to engage in some private reflection or imaginations or recollections about each of the three themes. Just to say again, leadership, economics, and intimate relationships. Leadership and intimate relationships.
Ancora una volta leadership, economics e rapporti intimi. Questi saranno i tre.
Later this afternoon, in my workshop, things will become even more experiential and interactive. Okay, 1, leadership. There are basically 3 different kinds of leadership. And I think this is true whether we are talking about formal national politics or within an organization or a profession. I call these 3 kinds of leadership heroic, sibling, and good enough. I'm not saying that any one of these is better than the others. spend some time on what I call good enough leadership, because this is very much my own contribution. Political theory and practice has assumed that there are just two main approaches to leadership. First, there is hierarchical and heroic leadership based on male authority and a masculine approach to knowledge that assumes there is one objectively true social story. In this model, there are good leaders and there are bad leaders, and we all have our lists of them. Max Weber had this kind of leader in mind when he referred in 1924 to the charismatic leader. This kind of leader, charismatic, is often seen in these days of Trump as a problem. A second approach is much more collaborative, involving a kind of metaphorical sibling model of leadership. This has been inspired by feminist thinking. But although appealing and sometimes usable, sibling leadership is just too demanding on citizens to be in operation all the time. People
è venuto a trovarci e non vuole interrompere la relazione, però il suo saluto a tutti i presenti gli chiedeva di portarlo, e al professor Samuel se può tradurre un saluto speciale.
He prefers not to interrupt you during the seminar, but he's sending his wishes to you, to us, to everyone, and celebrations.
I shall continue. Thank you, sir.
Grazie.
So, I'm saying, maybe, I'm going to read again, maybe being in control is not always valuable. This is a message to politicians. Being in control is not always valuable. Sometimes a little chaos is better.
Qualche volta un po' di caos è meglio.
Winnicott wrote that the parent fails the baby, but in the baby's own way. Now, this is new. The new text now. No, I mean, because I went back.
Allora, Winnicott scrisse che i genitori falliscono per il bambino, ma nel modo personale del bambino.
Okay. I would add that the leader fails the citizens, but in the citizens' own way. Bob Dylan, now we have to say Bob Dylan, the Nobel Prize winner. Bob Dylan nibbled away at the success-failure binary. When he sang, there's no success like failure, and failure's no success at all. And on September the 9th, 2007, Bill Clinton was reported on CNN as speaking of the inevitability of failure in politics in relation to his health care plan. I believe it was the first time that Clinton had explicitly spoken in that vein about failure. When Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister at the time, was asked by a journalist in 1963 what had brought him down, he just replied, "Events, dear boy, events." And now I would like to translate something, please, Marina. There is another aphorism from British politics that I would like to share.
C'è un altro aforismo dalla politica britannica che vorrebbe condividere con voi.
Every political career ends in failure. Every political career ends in failure, unless you die.
Tutte le carriere politiche finiscono in fallimento, almeno che non muori.
Now a little bit deeper.
Un po' più profondamente adesso.
Rumi, the Sufi poet Rumi, wrote in his poem Desire and the Importance of Failing that failure is the key to the kingdom of heaven. Failure is the key Good enoughness always involves failure. The key thing is how to manage failure, even to see failure as an art. Samuel Beckett wrote that we have to fail better. Disappointment is difficult, for sure, but it too has to be managed. So the good enough leader can accept the likelihood of failure in a post-heroic take on leadership. But there is a head-heart problem here, and it is a cultural complex. In our heads, we often know that the old-style leaders are dangerous. But in our hearts and guts, we feel we need the fatherly protection they offer. In our hearts, we are in love with a heroic leader whose Führer eroticism turns us on. In our heads, we agree with Brecht's Galileo, unhappy is the land that has need of heroes. Could we become more aware, more conscious of our abusive love affair with heroic leaders? There is a definite gender issue here. Sorry, I need this because of the synchronicity.
Adesso ho bisogno di questo giornale perché ci hanno fatto di sincronia qua.
Some of the collective responses over the years to Hillary Clinton shows how hard it is for a female leader to fulfill compellingly the role of a heroic leader. On the one hand, this is a welcome development because, as I have been suggesting, we often enter into abusive relationships with such heroic leaders. On the other hand, there is a kind of literalism and essentialism in play in which a woman can never fulfill any of the functions we associate to father. So what female leaders have to do is to be deadlier than the men, deadlier than the male, as we saw in Britain with Mrs. Thatcher. The great thing about good enough leaders is that they can be good enough leaders of whatever sex. Here's the synchronicity.
E qui c'è la sincronicità del fatto.
Today in The Guardian,
Oggi nel Guardian,
Hillary Clinton's campaign press director has been interviewed.
La direttrice di stampa di Hillary Clinton è stata intervistata.
And this is what she said.
E qui c'è quello che ha detto.
You can see there, you can translate it. We reduced.
Would you like me to read it in English first?
No, just translate.
Abbiamo ridotto Hillary a un facsimile femminile del presidente maschile. Per forza la gente pensava che lei fosse inautentica o non autentica. Che non fosse autentica o che fosse inautentica. Come preferite.
So, I thought I would bring it.
Interessante. Interesting.
Yeah. So far, so good enough. But what happens to our good enough leaders when things get violent? This is where good enough leadership appears to hit a rock. What happens when things get warlike? Where does good enough leadership leave us with respect to violent action? This question will not go away, whether we are talking about legitimate war, illegitimate war, state terror, and violently repressive action, or suicide bombing, and the...
Non è necessariamente vero in Italia o negli Stati Uniti che ci...
Yeah, but in this case, the consequences of trying to lead and failing, I think it's more intense if Italy is as you describe.
Come in questo caso, se uno tenta di fare leader e dopo fallisce, basandosi su quello che hai spiegato, sembrerebbe che in Italia la situazione diventa ancora più intensa.
Okay. Let's, but first of all, thank you.
Except in political career.
Esatto.